The flight landed 3 days early. A canceled summit in Singapore, a rare alignment of atmospheric grace and corporate collapse, had gifted Naomi 24 hours of silence before her life resumed its punishing rhythm. She didn't tell anyone she was coming home. Not her assistant, who would have arranged a car and filled her refrigerator with artisanal water. Not the board, who would have filled the vacuum with emergency meetings. Not her parents, who would have asked only about the failed acquisition. Their voices edged with the familiar disappointment of a love that was always transactional. For the first time in a decade, she wanted to arrive somewhere unannounced, to walk into her own life as a stranger. Her penthouse was exactly as she had left it, a cathedral of polished concrete and glass, silent and sterile as a museum exhibit. The air, filtered and temperature-controlled, carried no scent of life. It was a space designed to be looked at, not lived in. She dropped her keys into a ceramic bowl, the clatter echoing in the cavernous quiet. Loneliness, a familiar colleague, greeted her from the shadows. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the city, a glittering tapestry of lives she would never touch. Below, cars moved like blood cells through the city's arteries, each one carrying someone home to a place that smelled of food and family. Her home smelled only of glass cleaner and ambition. Then she heard it, a sound so alien in her world of hushed negotiations and muted conference calls that it took her a moment to identify. Laughter. Not the polite, restrained chuckle of a cocktail party, but the pure, uninhibited cascade of a child's joy. It was coming from the balcony of the adjacent apartment, a unit smaller than hers, one she'd never paid any mind to. She moved closer to the glass, a moth drawn to an unfamiliar flame. On the balcony next door stood a man and a little girl. The man, a tall, broad-shouldered black man in a simple gray t-shirt, was holding a small clear jar. His dark brown skin seemed to absorb the last rays of the setting sun. The child, a little black girl, whose hair was styled in beautiful braids with colorful beads that clicked softly as she bounced on her toes, was pointing at the jar with an expression of rapturous focus. Naomi couldn't hear their words, only the musical rise and fall of their voices. The man knelt, bringing himself to the child's eye level. He said something that made her giggle, a sound like wind chimes. He unscrewed the lid of the jar. A monarch butterfly, a flash of impossible orange against the gray cityscape, fluttered out. It rested for a moment on the man's outstretched finger, its wings pulsing gently. The little girl's hands flew to her mouth in a silent gasp of awe. The man's face, when he looked at the child, was transformed. Every line of exhaustion she could now see etched around his eyes was erased by a look of such profound, gentle love that it made Naomi's breath catch in her throat. He wasn't looking at a CEO or a quarterly report or a stock ticker. He was looking at his entire world. The butterfly took flight, a tiny vessel of life against the steel and glass. It drifted over the railing, catching a current of wind, and disappeared into the twilight. The little girl clapped her hands. The man scooped her into his arms, and she wrapped her legs around his waist, burying her face in his neck. He held her as if she were made of spun glass and moonlight. Naomi stood frozen, a hand pressed against the cold window. She had witnessed something sacred, a private ceremony of love and release. She had seen the neighbor's face. It wasn't a look of shock or alarm at seeing her, an unexpected observer. He hadn't seen her at all. His face held a universe of peace she had only read about in books. It was the face of a man who was truly home. And in that quiet moment, watching a life so different from her own, a life that had room for wonder and butterflies, Naomi felt the first, terrifying crack appear in the fortress she had built around her heart. Everything was about to change. His name was Elias. His world began at 5:30 a.m., not with the chime of a smart device, but with the quiet padding of his own feet on the worn wooden floors of the two-bedroom apartment he called home. He moved through the pre-dawn stillness with a practiced economy of motion, a dance he'd perfected over the last 4 years. First, the coffee maker, a low gurgle that was the house's first sign of life. Then, to his daughter's room. Amara slept the way she did everything else, with total commitment. She was a tangle of limbs and bright pink pajamas, her small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Her beaded braids were fanned out across the pillow, a colorful halo around her head. On her nightstand, a stuffed elephant named Peanut stood guard next to a glass of water. Elias stood in the doorway for a long moment, just watching her breathe. This was his ritual, his morning prayer. In the silence, he could almost feel the presence of his wife, Lena. He could hear her whisper, "You're doing a good job, Eli." He wasn't sure he was, but he held onto the thought like a life raft. He woke her not with a shout, but with a gentle touch to her shoulder and the smell of the single pancake he was inevitably burning. "Time to wake up, butterfly," he'd murmur. Amara's eyes would flutter open. "Is the pancake black again, Daddy?" she'd ask, her voice thick with sleep. "It's not black," he'd reply with a mock-dignified tone. "It's caramelized." This was their morning routine, a small pocket of domestic comedy that buffered them against the world. Their apartment was modest, the furniture a collection of second-hand pieces and items they'd had since before Amara was born. But it was not a sad place. Every available surface was covered in Amara's artwork. Crayon-drawn suns with squiggly rays smiled down from the refrigerator. Paper chains in a riot of colors were draped over the windows. The walls were a testament to a child's vibrant imagination, a gallery of love. It was a home, not just a residence. It was filled. Elias worked as a logistics coordinator for a shipping company near the port. It was a job of schedules and systems, of making sure boxes got from one place to another. It was not glamorous. It did not come with stock options or corner offices. But it was steady. It paid the bills. It allowed him to be home by 5:30 every single day to pick Amara up from her after-school program. His hands, which were large and calloused from a youth spent working in warehouses, were now expert at tying tiny shoes and packing a lunchbox with the crusts cut off the sandwiches, just the way Amara liked. His life had been split in two, the time before Lena's illness and the time after. Before, there had been laughter that filled every corner of their home, dreams of a bigger house, of more children. Lena had been the sun. Her energy, her light, had animated their world. Her death, a swift and brutal illness that had stolen her from them in under a year, had been an eclipse. For a long time, Elias had felt like he was living in the shadow. But then he would look at Amara, this bright, beautiful little girl who had her mother's eyes and her own fierce spirit, and he knew he couldn't stay in the dark. He had to be the light for her. So he learned. He learned how to do her hair, though he admitted freely he had no idea how to do French braids. He learned her favorite bedtime stories by heart. He learned that her tears could be stopped with a hug and a promise to look for fireflies after dinner. He channeled all the love he still had for Lena into being the best father he could be for their daughter. He never asked for help. He never complained. He just did the work. His kindness was not a performance. It was reflexive, the native language of his heart. He carried his grief not as a burden, but as a quiet reminder of how precious life was, of how important it was to be present for every single imperfect, beautiful moment. Naomi's world was a stark contrast. Her mornings began at 4:30 a.m. with the blue light of her laptop. Her home was a minimalist expanse of white walls and chrome fixtures. There were no crayon drawings on her stainless steel refrigerator. There were only Pellegrino, a container of organic blueberries, and a single, perfect orchid that was watered twice a week by a service. Her life was a meticulously curated series of successes. She was the CEO of a billion-dollar tech firm, a black woman who had shattered every glass ceiling placed above her. She commanded boardrooms with a quiet, unshakable authority. Her suits were tailored, her schedule was optimized, her emotions were regulated, but in the silent moments before the city woke up, the silence of her apartment would press in on her. It was a heavy, suffocating thing. She had achieved everything her parents had ever demanded of her. She had the grades, the degrees, the title, the wealth. They were proud in their way. They would boast about her to their friends. But they had never once looked at her and said, "We're proud of you, not for what you've done, but for who you are." Love in her childhood home had been a reward for performance. Affection was a bonus for exceeding expectations. As a result, she had never learned to be loved without conditions. She had never felt safe enough to be vulnerable. Her professional success was her armor. Her composure was her shield. She was brilliant, respected, and even feared. But she was profoundly, achingly alone. She had sacrificed personal fulfillment for professional achievement. And now, standing at the pinnacle of her career, she realized the view was cold and empty. She had a team, but no friends. She had assets, but no home. She would attend lavish galas and charity events, smiling for the cameras, her natural hair pulled back in an elegant updo, her deep brown skin luminous under the lights. She looked like a woman who had everything. But when she returned to her silent penthouse, she would sit in the dark and feel a hollowness so vast it threatened to consume her. She had curated a perfect life, but it was a life without joy. It was a life without butterflies. The encounter happened on a Tuesday night. It was late, past 11, and Naomi was hunched over her laptop, the glow of a spreadsheet illuminating her face. A storm had rolled in, and rain lashed against the panoramic windows. Suddenly, there was a sound from the kitchen, a strange, gushing noise. She ignored it at first, assuming it was the wind. But it grew louder, more insistent. Annoyed, she pushed back from her desk and walked toward the sound. Water was pouring from under her designer sink. Not a drip, but a steady stream, already forming a large pool on the polished concrete floor. Panic, an unfamiliar and unwelcome emotion, seized her. She was a woman who could handle hostile takeovers and international negotiations, but she had no idea what to do about a burst pipe. She stared at the spreading water, her mind, usually so sharp and decisive, going completely blank. She thought of calling the building's concierge, but she knew the emergency maintenance line was notoriously slow. The water was already nearing the edge of an expensive Persian rug. Her mind raced. She thought of the man next door, the father, the man with the gentle face. It was a desperate, absurd idea. She was Naomi King, CEO. She didn't ask neighbors for help. She paid people to solve her problems. But the water was rising, and her carefully controlled world was literally flooding. Humiliation warred with desperation. Desperation won. She grabbed a cashmere throw to try and stanch the flow, a futile gesture. Then, taking a deep breath, she walked out into the hallway, her bare feet cold on the marble floor. She knocked on his door. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet hall. A few moments later, the door opened. It was him, Elias. He was wearing soft-looking sweatpants and the same gray t-shirt she'd seen him in before. His feet were bare. His short, natural hair was slightly rumpled, and his eyes were soft with sleep, but they cleared instantly when he saw the look on her face. I I'm so sorry to bother you, she began, her voice clipped and professional even in her panic. I'm your neighbor, Naomi King. I seem to have a plumbing situation. He didn't smile. He didn't look annoyed. He just looked at her, then passed her to the water seeping from under her doorway. Stay here, he said. It was a gentle command. He disappeared back into his apartment for a second and returned with a large wrench and a flashlight. He walked past her into her apartment without waiting for an invitation. He moved with a quiet competence that immediately calmed her frantic energy. He found the water shut-off valve in a utility closet she hadn't known existed and, with a grunt of effort, turned it. The gushing sound subsided to a drip, then silence. He stood up, wiping his dark hands on his pants. He surveyed the damage, his expression thoughtful. It looks like a feeder line to the faucet burst. You'll need a plumber in the morning, but the water is off. It won't get any worse. Naomi stood in the middle of her flooded kitchen, feeling utterly useless. The cashmere throw was soaked. She was the one with the Ivy League education and the billion-dollar company, but he was the one who knew how to make the world stop falling apart. Thank you, she said, the words feeling inadequate. I'll pay you for your time, of course. Elias finally looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not pity, but a kind of gentle understanding. You don't have to pay me, he said softly. It's just what neighbors do. He paused, taking in her trembling hands and the shock on her face. You look like you could use some tea. Before she could protest, he was gone, returning a minute later with a steaming mug. It wasn't a delicate porcelain cup from a matching set. It was a thick, sturdy ceramic mug with a chipped rim and a cartoon drawing of a smiling sun on it. The tea smelled of ginger and lemon. Drink this, he said, pressing it into her hands. She took the mug. Its warmth seeped into her cold fingers. She looked from his calm, tired face to the ridiculous smiling sun on the mug, and a strange pressure built behind her eyes. No one had made her tea in years. No one had ever done something for her without an agenda, without wanting something in return. This man, this stranger, had offered her simple, unconditional kindness. And for the first time since she was a little girl, Naomi King started to cry. Not loud, dramatic sobs, but silent, hot tears that tracked down her cheeks and dripped into the ginger tea. It was the first act of kindness, a small, simple gesture that had breached defenses a lifetime of corporate warfare could not. The plumber couldn't come until the end of the week. Naomi's state-of-the-art kitchen was a disaster zone, with industrial fans roaring day and night to dry the floors. She subsisted on protein bars and room service from a nearby hotel, feeling like a refugee in her own home. The disruption to her routine was maddening. On the second day, there was a soft knock on her door. It was Elias, and hiding shyly behind his leg was Amara. The little girl clutched a piece of paper in her hand. Just wanted to see how the drying was going, Elias said, his voice a low rumble that was somehow calming amidst the noise of the fans. And Amara has something for you? He gently nudged his daughter forward. Amara held out the piece of paper. It was a crayon drawing. It depicted a giant, lopsided butterfly with bright orange wings flying over a very blue puddle of water. At the bottom, in wobbly letters, it said, "For the sad lady." Naomi stared at the drawing. Her throat felt tight. "The sad lady?" she whispered, looking at Amara. Amara nodded solemnly, her beads clicking. "Daddy said your house was crying, and that made you cry, so I made you a butterfly to make it feel better." Naomi knelt down, so she was on the little girl's level. She had negotiated multi-million-dollar deals without blinking, but the unfiltered honesty of this child had completely disarmed her. She took the drawing as if it were a precious artifact. "Thank you, Amara," she said, her voice husky. "It's the most beautiful butterfly I have ever seen." A slow, brilliant smile spread across Amara's face. She looked from Naomi to her father, a question in her eyes. Elias understood. "My daughter wants to know if you'd like to have dinner with us," he said, a faint hint of color rising in his cheeks. "Since your kitchen is out of commission, it's just spaghetti, nothing fancy." Every instinct in Naomi's body screamed no. It was a breach of protocol. It was inefficient. It was intimate. But then she looked at the drawing in her hand, at the hopeful look on the little girl's face, and she heard herself say, "I would love that." Dinner was chaotic and perfect. The spaghetti sauce was a little burnt on the bottom of the pot. Amara spilled her milk twice. The conversation was a stream of non-sequiturs from the 6-year-old, who wanted to know if Naomi had ever seen a unicorn and why grown-ups had to work so much. Naomi, who usually dined at restaurants where the silence was part of the price, found herself laughing, a real, genuine laugh that startled her. She sat on the floor with Amara after dinner, looking through a stack of her drawings. Elias sat on the couch, watching them, a quiet, unreadable expression on his face. "Why is your hair in a cage?" Amara asked, reaching out a small hand to touch Naomi's elegant bun. Naomi froze. "It's not a cage, sweetie, it's just a professional hairstyle." "You should let it out," Amara declared. "It wants to be free, like the butterfly." Later, after Amara was asleep, Naomi and Elias sat in the quiet living room. The industrial fans from her apartment were a dull roar in the background. "She's incredible," Naomi said softly. "She's her mother's daughter," Elias replied, his gaze distant. "Lena? She saw the world like that, full of wonder. No cages." An unspoken permission hung in the air. For the first time, they talked. Not as a CEO and a neighbor, but as two people. Naomi spoke of the crushing weight of expectation, of a life spent chasing a version of success that had left her feeling hollow. It was more than she had ever told anyone. Elias spoke of Lena. He didn't speak of her death with tragedy, but of her life with a reverence that was breathtaking. He described her laugh, the way she gardened on their small balcony, the fierce love she had for Amara. He was sharing the most precious part of himself, and he was trusting her with it. It was the shared wound. He had lost the love of his life. She had never had a love that was real. They were both survivors of different kinds of loss. They sat in a comfortable silence. The space between them filled not with awkwardness, but with a profound, unspoken understanding. When she finally left to go back to her own empty, noisy apartment, she felt a strange sense of peace. The walls of her fortress, breached by a simple act of kindness, were beginning to crumble, brick by brick. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what she might find in the ruins. She was hopeful. Over the next few days, a new, fragile routine began to form. Elias would check on her. Amara would bring her a new drawing each day. One evening, Naomi found herself helping Elias with the dishes, standing shoulder to shoulder in his small kitchen, the scent of soap and leftover spaghetti filling the air. It felt more real than any 5-star restaurant she had ever been to. The world, however, does not stop for healing. Naomi's world, in particular, was predatory. The news of her extended, unscheduled absence from the office had begun to circulate. Whispers turned to rumors. The most venomous of these were fanned by Marcus Henderson, a rival board member who had long coveted her position. He was a man who saw kindness as weakness and vulnerability as an opportunity. He hired a private investigator. It didn't take long to get photos. They were innocuous. Naomi laughing on Elias's balcony, Naomi kneeling to accept a drawing from Amara. But in the cold, cynical world of corporate power plays, the images could be twisted. Henderson saw his chance. An article appeared on a popular business gossip blog. The headline was cruel and calculated. CEO Naomi King's breakdown. Tech queen shacks up with working-class neighbor amidst company crisis. The piece was a masterclass in insinuation. It painted Naomi as an unstable leader, neglecting her duties for an inappropriate and distracting dalliance. It was filled with classist undertones, contrasting her penthouse with his modest apartment, her tailored suits with his simple work clothes. It questioned her judgment, her stability, her fitness to lead. It was designed to humiliate her, to isolate her, to destroy her. Naomi's assistant forwarded her the link with a simple, frantic message. Emergency board meeting called for 10 a.m. tomorrow. Naomi read the article, her blood turning to ice. It wasn't the attack on her leadership that wounded her. It was the violation. They had taken something pure and fragile, a nascent friendship, a child's innocent affection, and twisted it into something ugly and transactional. They had dragged Elias and Amara into her toxic world. She felt a surge of protective fury so fierce it left her breathless. For years, her only instinct had been to protect her company, her reputation. Now her only thought was of protecting them. The shame she felt was immense. She had brought this ugliness to their door. She thought about calling Elias, about trying to explain, but what could she say? The damage was done. Her world had poisoned his. The boardroom was a theater of corporate warfare, and Naomi was on stage. The air was thick with tension. The other board members, a collection of gray-suited men, and one other woman, refused to meet her eyes. Marcus Henderson, however, was staring at her with an expression of triumphant pity. He had the article printed out and placed at every seat. "Naomi," the chairman began, his voice heavy with false concern, "we are all very worried about you. This is not a good look. It suggests a lack of focus, a lapse in judgment at a critical time." Henderson leaned forward. "With all due respect, it's more than a lapse in judgment. It's a sign of instability. Our CEO is clearly not in the right headspace to lead this company through the upcoming merger. Perhaps a leave of absence is in order." He said the words with a surgeon's precision, each one designed to cut. They all looked at her, expecting a defense. They expected her to deny the story, to downplay the connection, to promise to sever all ties with the man and his child. They expected her to fight for her title, for her power, for the company she had built. Naomi stood up. She was wearing a simple, elegant black dress. Her natural hair was not in its usual severe bun. It was looser, softer. She looked at each member of the board, her gaze calm and steady. When her eyes met Henderson's, there was no fear in them. There was only a quiet, profound clarity. "You're right, Marcus," she said, her voice clear and even, filling the silent room. "I have not been in the right headspace. For years, my headspace has been this room. It has been quarterly reports and stock prices and market share." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I have spent my entire life pursuing a version of success that you all celebrate. I have sacrificed everything for it, and I succeeded. I am one of the most powerful women in this industry, and I have never been more empty." She picked up the printed article. She didn't look at it with anger, but with a kind of sad detachment. You see this as a sign of instability. You see this man, Elias, as a distraction, a liability. You want to know what I see? She looked directly at Henderson. "I see a man who works a 10-hour day and then comes home and has the energy to be a gentle, present, and loving father. I see a man whose wealth is not measured in stocks, but in the unconditional love of his daughter. He teaches her about kindness by living it. He shows her wonder in a world that you all see only in terms of profit and loss. He showed me more about strength and integrity in 1 week than I have learned in this boardroom in 10 years. A stunned silence descended on the room. This was not the speech they had expected. "You talk about a leave of absence," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "You're right. I do need one. I am taking an indefinite leave of absence effective immediately, not because I am unstable, but because I am finally, for the first time in my life, becoming sane. I am choosing a life that has room for butterflies. I am choosing a life where value is not determined by a stock price, but by small, quiet acts of grace." She dropped the article on the table. "You can have the company," she said, her voice softening. "You can have the title. It was never what mattered." Without another word, she turned and walked out of the boardroom. She didn't look back. She left behind the stunned faces, the silent phones, the entire world she had fought so hard to conquer. She walked out of the glass tower and into the sunlight, feeling lighter than she had in her entire life. She was no longer a CEO. She was just Naomi, and she was finally going home. She didn't take a car. She walked. The 15 blocks from her office tower to her apartment building felt like a pilgrimage. The sounds of the city, usually a source of stress, seemed different now, vibrant, alive. She felt every step, every breath. She was shedding a skin, leaving behind the armor she had worn for so long. When she reached the apartment building, she didn't go to her own door. She went to his. She knocked softly. Elias opened the door. He had seen the article. She knew it the moment she saw his face. His expression was a mixture of concern and a deep, weary sadness. He had a look that said he wasn't surprised the world was cruel, only that it had found its way to him. "Naomi?" he said, his voice quiet. "I'm so sorry, Elias," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "I never wanted to bring that into your life, into Amara's life." He just shook his head, a silent dismissal of her apology. He stepped aside, a silent invitation to come in. The apartment was quiet. The comforting smell of cinnamon hung in the air. "Where's Amara?" she asked. "On the balcony," he said. "She's waiting for the fireflies to come out." Naomi walked through the living room, past the walls covered in artwork, and stepped out onto the balcony. The sun had set, and the sky was a deep, bruised purple. The city lights were beginning to twinkle. Amara was sitting on a small stool, her chin in her hands, staring out at the twilight. She heard Naomi approach and turned, her face lighting up. "You came," she cried, running to her. Naomi knelt and hugged the little girl, burying her face in her hair. She held on tight, breathing in the scent of shampoo and childhood. "I came," she whispered. She stood up, still holding Amara's hand, and looked at Elias, who had followed her out. She didn't need to tell him what happened at the board meeting. He could see it in her face. The tension was gone. The hard, protective shell had dissolved. "I chose this," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. She gestured around the small balcony, at the pot of struggling geraniums, at the little girl holding her hand, at the man standing before her. "This is what's real." Elias's eyes searched hers. He saw the truth of her words, the finality of her choice. A slow, beautiful smile touched his lips. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply reached out and took her free hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. Amara, sensing the shift in the universe, let go of Naomi's hand. She ran back inside and returned a moment later, clutching a piece of paper. It was a new drawing. She held it up for them to see. It showed 3 stick figures. On the left was a tall man with brown skin and short hair. On the right was a woman, almost as tall, with long, flowing hair and brown skin. In the middle, holding both their hands, was a little girl with beaded braids. Above them, a giant yellow sun was smiling. "See," Amara said, her voice filled with a child's irrefutable logic. "It's our family now. A daddy, and a me, and a Naomi." Naomi looked at the drawing, at the simple, perfect depiction of a life she never knew she wanted. She saw how Amara had drawn her hair, not in a cage, but free. The tears that came this time were not tears of sadness or relief. They were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She looked at Elias, his hand holding hers, his eyes reflecting the city lights, and she knew she had never been more powerful or more free. She was home. 6 months passed. The city moved from the heat of summer to the crisp air of autumn. The business world buzzed for weeks about Naomi King's spectacular departure, but eventually, as it always does, it moved on. Marcus Henderson got the CEO position he had always wanted and promptly ran the company's stock into the ground. Naomi never looked back. She sold the penthouse, donating a significant portion of the proceeds to a non-profit that supported women in STEM. She moved into a small, charming house with a garden in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. It wasn't a house designed to be featured in a magazine. It was a house designed for living. Her new life was slower, more deliberate. She started a small consulting firm, helping mission-driven startups find their footing. She worked from a sun-filled office at the back of her new house, but she closed her laptop at 4 o'clock every day, because at 4:30, Elias and Amara would arrive. Their relationship had unfolded as naturally as a flower turning toward the sun. There was no grand, dramatic declaration. Love was not a statement. It was a series of small, accumulated moments. It was Elias fixing a leaky faucet in her new house. It was Naomi finally learning how to make pancakes that weren't burnt. It was sitting on the porch together in the evening, watching Amara chase fireflies in the backyard, their shoulders touching in the companionable silence. One Saturday afternoon, they were all in the garden. Naomi, dressed in old jeans and a faded t-shirt, her beautiful natural hair now in a soft, loose afro, was showing Amara how to plant tulip bulbs. Elias was nearby, mending a section of the fence. The air smelled of damp earth and possibility. Amara patted the soil down over a bulb, her small hands covered in dirt. She looked up at Naomi, her expression serious. "Naomi," she said, "does this mean you're staying forever?" The question, so simple and direct, hung in the autumn air. It was the question that lingered beneath every shared meal, every goodnight hug. It was the question their hearts had been asking, but their mouths had been too afraid to voice. Naomi's breath caught. She looked over at Elias. He had stopped working. He was watching her, his hammer resting by his side, his face open and vulnerable. In his eyes, she saw the same question reflected. She turned back to Amara. She reached out and gently brushed a smudge of dirt from the little girl's cheek. Her own eyes were shining with tears, but her smile was steady and bright. "Yes, butterfly," she whispered, her voice full of a certainty that resonated deep in her soul. "It means I'm staying forever." Elias walked over to them. He knelt in the dirt, putting one arm around Naomi and the other around his daughter, pulling them into a circle of warmth. He didn't propose with a ring or a grand speech. His proposal was in the quiet pressure of his hand, in the look of profound gratitude in his eyes. It was in the simple, breathtaking fact that they had built this, a family. Not from blood or obligation, but from choice. The narrator's voice, warm and reflective, settles over the scene. Love, it turns out, is not found in the grand gestures or the dramatic declarations. It is not something you earn through achievement or acquire through status. It is built in the small, quiet spaces. It is built in a shared cup of ginger tea on a rainy night. It is built in a child's crayon drawing of a butterfly. It is built in the courage to walk away from a life that is full of everything except what matters. True wealth is not a penthouse with a view of the city. It is a garden filled with tulips waiting to bloom. True power is not the ability to command a boardroom. It is the vulnerability to let someone see you, truly see you, and the courage to see them in return. For Naomi, Elias, and Amara, forever had already begun. It had started with a burnt pancake, a burst pipe, and a neighbor's face. A face that held not the reflection of her power, but the promise of a home. And in being truly seen, they had all been saved.